All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this evening. I first want to let you know that Sister Maria Pascuzzi is not able to be with us this evening. She had an event that she needed to go to, so she's sorry to miss it, but she will catch up next at our next session. We want to apologize first for all of the problems that we've been having, especially last week with the links for this course. So if you know someone who didn't receive a link, or if you yourself didn't receive a link, thank you for your patience. We've been working on the problem. We think we've resolved the problem, but there still might be a few stragglers out there that we missed. So if you hear of anything, please certainly let us know and just have them email me and I can send a generic link in the meantime. And then again, real quick, we just want to thank you for all of your support and donations that you've already made. And we're very grateful because, as you know, our programs are funded by strictly donations. So thank you so much for your generosity. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Joshua.
Hi, really nice to see you all again today. Thank you for joining us, both live and if you're tuning in through the recording on YouTube. Also, thanks to everyone who was here last week as well. All right, so my thought was over the next hour or so before we open up for discussion, we would try to accomplish two things. The first is to pick up on a sub-theme of yesterday's, or excuse me, last week's session, where we're just acknowledging the diversity of Buddhist traditions, Buddhist practices, and Buddhist cultures. That's not a central focus of these discussions, but I think helpful to recognize. So we're going to start there, and eventually by the end of our hour, you'll see why some of the clips I'm going to be showing to demonstrate even just a tiny bit of Buddhist diversity, why it's actually so important for understanding our big topic this week, which is quite a doozy and involves some heavy material as we continue to delve into the complexity of the problem of suffering. And this week is going to be with a focus on a topic people have probably heard of, which is karma, which may or may not mean what you think it means. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about it. As usual, I think to facilitate more easily the learning on Zoom, we'll hold questions to the chat during the opening hour, but please feel free to dump ideas into the chat if you like. I can't guarantee I'll read every last one, but I'll do my best. It makes it a little bit more fun for me as well, just to know that folks are curious, generating questions and the like. All right, so in the briefest of reviews here, um, this is some material that we looked at last week. And here was a very brief image that's now linked to, by the way, in last week's recording up on YouTube. Is just a kind of a very broad map of the widespread of Buddhist ideas from the location of the historical Buddha, north, east, south, and elsewhere. Just noting here, or allowing us to note, the cultural diversity and really the really widespread, both the influence of Buddhism, but also you can imagine some of the changes that happened as Buddhism moved around these areas. And then secondly, as a way of a small review, right, we looked at a whole number of images representing Buddha. Here is an image of Buddha that doesn't even include Buddha. This is the Dharma wheel, which symbolically represents Buddhist teachings, some of which we started to learn last week with the Four Truths. And then we saw here a whole variety of representations of the Buddha. Here's a Buddha in what's called a Pure Land. This is an image from Tibet, a massive statue from Japan, a massive statue from Thailand, and then 6 different images that are all part of the Metropolitan Museum's collection. And again, all of these I just wanted to mention are now linked to, if you want to learn more about any of these locations or images, in our original recording that's up on YouTube. So that was our way of artistically at least getting a taste of Buddhist diversity. But now I want to spend even really just 5 minutes considering different ways of being Buddhist by showing you a couple different clips portraying typical Buddhist activities. So you'll bear with me, hopefully, now that we do some video that this works properly. But even these little tiny pieces, which I will do my best to link to for the recording that we're watching right now, if you want to return to the YouTube later, these clips will show us again just how different Buddhists look from one another, which is perhaps obvious, but something we don't think about, and also just how different their activities are. All right, so wish me good luck here. as we try to do some video sharing, starting here with perhaps what we imagine or expect from a video about Buddhists. Here we see some trainees in a center, a meditation center in monastery in Japan called Eiheiji, which is a very famous center, Zen tradition center, where trainees begin each day with meditation. And let's just listen in for a minute.
At Eiheiji, Zazen is practiced facing the wall. It's believed that this method allows the trainees to look deeper into themselves. The aim is to attain enlightenment and be free of desire and attachment. At 7 a.m., after about 3 hours of practicing Zazen and reciting sutras, they have breakfast.
So this might be a typical example of what people expect of Buddhist monks. Right, it's very serious looking, intent folks who are spending hours even before eating a bite of breakfast in the morning in meditation, dedicating their lives through their own discipline and intellectual pursuits, and of course, meditative pursuits to overcoming suffering and some of the ideas we introduced last class. But really, in fact, simply demographically, these folks are in the real vast minority, which is not to say that meditation traditions, some of which we'll learn about in a couple of weeks, aren't central to the path to liberation that we started to learn about already last week. But that doesn't mean that most Buddhists have time to meditate, in fact, historically. And it's really a much smaller part of the religious traditions of actual Buddhists, especially traditionally in Asia. So let's just look at a couple other examples of Buddhist activities, some of which are going to be crucial for understanding our subject today, which is karma.
People looking for spiritual support, a place they're looking for peace, and to answer their questions, solving their problems.
It's the largest Buddhist temple in the city, and it's become an important house of worship for the sprawling Chinese and Tibetan Buddhist communities that live nearby. It's a place to seek peace and ask the Buddha everyday questions.
If I can get through my college applications, get into the college I want, or where is how I can find a girlfriend, or I will be success in the business.
Even tourists and people of other faiths come to take in the tranquility and light incense sticks.
The incense smoke goes into the heaven. It's like a messenger to tell the Buddha, I'm comes in for praying.
The temple.
So sometimes people are surprised to see this video. This is an older news clip from a Mahayana temple, actually pretty close to where I am here in Lower Manhattan. That's in Chinatown in Manhattan. And this is totally typical of not just temples in the United States and not just Chinese forms of Buddhism, but Buddhisms around the world, where everyday folks show up in front of representations of Buddha or other related beings, powerful beings, that receive their offerings, whether that's forms of incense or water or candles or flowers or food. Very common in Chinese temples, you'll see people offering oranges and vegetable oil, making prostrations, bowing and praying, and participating in reciprocal religion, meaning asking for things, protection, health, or otherwise, sometimes really practical requests, asking for a blessing in an exam that you have. In a way, this is very normal for Buddhist practice, just like it's normal for religious practice at large. And yet, this is a central part of actually being a Buddhist. It's also a central part of the clergy, meaning like the Buddhist monks and nuns, to provide a place, a location, and take care of that location so that visitors can come and ask for things, essentially. So that's our first example. In the next clips, I want to see some other examples of offerings that we find very typically in Buddhist practice. Again, they're going to be crucial when we start understanding this idea of karma in just a minute. So in these clips, we actually saw two very typical practices in these most recent clips. The first two clips were from Sri Lanka, where we saw the centrality of making offerings to monks themselves. So here, monks understood to be totally normal human beings, despite their kind of important role in serving the community, right? And we'll talk a lot about the connection between making offerings. You saw literally people in the first clip feeding monks, why that's such an important moral and ethical role for lay people in Buddhist countries, like in Sri Lanka, very, very common in Southeast Asia. And then the second clip, there was an offering made to a monk who isn't just there to teach them the four truths and about karma and liberation and all the dramatic material that we are going to get to today and in our next couple of weeks, but also to function, as you may have seen, as a doctor. Totally normal in most Buddhist cultures that educated monks and to some extent nuns function in a medical capacity. And then the third clip was back from Japan, or back to Japan, during a really famous summer festival called the Oban Summer Festival, which is a festival when people invite back from the ancestral realm recently deceased family members. So it's a really important part of East Asian culture that people maintain their what's called filial responsibility, their responsibility to continue to honor family members even after they die. And this, in this case, we saw how this works at a special time of year where a professional, a Buddhist priest in this case, actually visits people's homes in order to make offerings to Buddha at a shrine, but also to invite home these ancestors who are hopefully in a peaceful place, but might be struggling in between the period of dying and finding a new home, whether through rebirth or otherwise. And we'll talk about rebirth in a bit. So again, we're seeing how making offerings, but also relating with clergy, in this case, monks, is just a totally everyday normal thing for Buddhists, which means also the monks themselves have jobs beyond just meditating and learning Buddhist philosophy to overcome suffering. They're literally in the service industry, right? Serving people, right, by allowing them to perform good deeds on their behalf and also helping them care for family members who are deceased. Okay, last little bit that we'll need for later today, two clips of Buddhist chanting, okay, which is also absolutely central. It's also fun to listen to when understanding like what Buddhists actually do. If our prejudice coming in, which is fine if that's what it was, or is that most Buddhists are silent and meditate, you would be surprised how noisy most Buddhist practices and rituals are. So two quick examples here. The first from, I believe, a Thai community, and the second one from a American, kind of diverse American community that's built off of a certain very popular set of Japanese ideas. So our clips can be here in the United States. All right, one more round here. Let's see how this goes. You notice, by the way, all of the money and everyday objects, including water, that are used here as an offering to the temple at large and to the representations of Buddha that are off here up on the top left of the screen. But why I'm showing this video is not just because of the offerings, the everyday offerings, but also you see here some clergy, by the way, on the right, but also to listen to the chanting in uniform.
What we're chanting every day is Nam Yo Ho Renge Kyo. What it means is that we devote our lives to bringing forth our highest life condition, world peace, as well as transforming our life and transforming the world. And by chanting over and over, it would be like polishing.
So we'll stop there for now, not with our whole presentation, but with the videos. But just as quick review, we saw Buddhists as meditators, disciplined, seriously pursuing the path of liberation, which I promise we will continue talking about. But also Buddhists engaging in what we might consider to be prayer, making offerings to representations of Buddha and asking for something in return. We saw Buddhists caring for monks, feeding and caring for monks, and then being cared by monks in return, right? And we saw all of these examples of chanting. Oh, also, by the way, Buddhists helping you care for your deceased family members. Famously, Buddhist institutions are often in the funeral business in East Asia. And then finally, we saw all of the chanting. So what does this have to do with our discussion of suffering? Well, it's going to take us a minute to get there, but hopefully by the end of this class, we'll have a little bit of a better idea of how actually all of these practices are totally folded into the original program we were discussing, which is the program of overcoming suffering. So let's dive right in here with karma, and we'll see how karma itself is, in fact, a teaching that explains some of the mechanism of our suffering. So the bad news, in fairness, on a Thursday night, for those watching live, is we're really going to get back into the muck here. I mean, it's a little bit unpleasant to take seriously in a way how twisted we are in our habits, or let's say our habitual planting of the seeds of our own suffering, which is a poetic way as I can put it, right? We could be a little bit more blunt about this, and perhaps we will in a few minutes. But the idea is that we're really in a mess. We're in a mess in a way of our own making. So I want to talk about some of the Buddhist ideas about why. That being said, the flip side of today's conversation, which will start to become more clear in upcoming weeks, is how the very seeds of the mess that we're in allow for the possibility of transformation. So as bad news as it's going to sound like I'm delivering, from a Buddhist perspective, all of the bad news itself actually good news. It's all possibilities for awakening and improvement. You'll have to trust me on that for now, but I think you'll see what I mean in coming weeks. All right, so let's dive right in here, if I can. Right. Great. So this is our big question today. Hopefully you can see the slide. What is karma? Karma is actually a pretty tricky topic in Buddhist teachings with many different interpretations. I'm going to do what's the equivalent of essentially a textbook presentation. And again, we'll try to generate as many examples as we can. I'll offer a couple, and to the extent that you're willing to play along as you watch on video or here live, I'd really recommend doing so. I don't mean that in a pedantic sense, but without actually thinking about real examples from our lives, we simply can't understand what karma means. All right, so the term itself is really simple. Karma simply means actions. The catch here is karma is always connected with a term called phala, which you don't see here, which is a Sanskrit term that literally means fruit. So actions and their fruition, which is a fancy way of saying actions as causes that always lead to effects. So anytime you're learning about karma, and this is particularly the case in the philosophical tradition in India and Tibet, you're always talking about the law of cause and effect. But the law of cause and effect works in ways that maybe we haven't really considered. That's the rest of this conversation today, right? So one of the first things to note is that when Buddhist teachers are talking about karmic actions. They are not simply mentioning the big dramatic things we do in our lives, right? Like the time we moved from this country to the other, or proposed to a significant other, or I don't know, saved someone from drowning, or whatever, behaved so poorly on the worst day of our lives, or whatever it might be. Those are actions. But actually, we are constantly engaging in physical actions. And for better for worse, even right now, passively watching a video or actively watching a video, no offense intended, you're also generating physical karma, even just by positioning your body in certain ways. We'll talk about that. But of course, along with physical karma is verbal karma. And again, the Buddha knows that there's some overlapping between these categories. In Indian Buddhism, you get lots and lots and lots of overlapping lists, right? But the idea here is that verbal karma also has effects. Sometimes in American culture, we think that, well, saying something isn't the same thing as doing something, right? Well, if I say something out loud, I say something obnoxious to someone, or even I promise to do something, that's very different than carrying out the action. Of course, this is the case, right? A verbal action and a physical action, saying, like, I'm going to hit you, which is unpleasant and violent in its own way, is very different from carrying through the action. But the point here is they both have consequences and really significant ones. It's not just our physical actions that count, but our verbal actions that count. And even more importantly, and this is quite crucial in most Buddhist renditions, the mental actions, the intentions that precede our physical and verbal matter a great deal, which means even simply by daydreaming or concentrating or generating thoughts or responses right now on video, you're generating mental karma. In fact, we're constantly generating mental karma. This is good news and bad news. It's good news because through disciplines of attention, we can transform our experiences through attending even to our mental intentions. How are we going to transform them? We have to get there. The bad news, and I hate to tell you, it's bad news for all of us, is that we are always, always, always generating mental karma without even noticing it. So, how many times do we have kind of obsessive thoughts that repeat over and over and over again that impact how we feel about somebody when we see them? A great example of this would be the mental activity of dreaming. Please think of an example if you're willing to, and I can see some of you, so maybe some of you guys will giggle, right? When you had a dream about somebody, a family member, a friend acting really obnoxiously in your dream, right? Yeah. I mean, I do it all the time. I hate to say. I'm just a professor here, right? And then you wake up and you realize, oh, it's just a dream. But does that mean that you forgive the person? Not if you're anything like me, right? You can still be mad at somebody that you live with or a friend or family member just because you had a dream where they said something obnoxious to you or didn't do what you wanted. Why? Because there's an impact of the mental experience, right? This is just how our minds work, right? Even purely mental experiences, a dream, as we recognize, only occurs in our mind and is absent from the physical world, still has an impact. And this is a relatively innocuous example, but we'll have more dramatic examples as we go. All right, so where were we here? We were thinking about all of the mental actions and physical actions and verbal actions we carry out, right? The short story is there are many, many, many of them, and they date back all the way to the beginning of our lives. They all have some kind of a consequence. What kind of a consequence we're going to have to talk about it. Even those that we don't notice we are enacting, which is really common, I'm sure, if you can think of other examples with verbal karma. How often do we have conversations without paying attention to what we're even saying? Or repeat certain phrases habitually, right? So common, and yet they all have some kind of an impact. So, what kinds of impacts are there? Well, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about effects. And again, the Buddha made a lot of lists in his sermons, which means Buddhists interpret them in many different ways. So there are other possible lists here. But I've combined a couple categories to present four of them that I found work relatively well in class to at least getting us thinking about this material. Some of them you've heard of before and are very dramatic, but some of them towards the end of this presentation, I think you will find to be both more mundane, but also more relatable. So please hang tight. So we got to start with the big one. One of the effects in a karmic system of your actions, which are what? Your physical, verbal, and mental, is influencing where you're going to be reborn, which means there is a commitment to the mental continuity of consciousness that continues past this life. And that means it's been going on before this life as well. This is a big hang up, I think, for people who didn't grow up in Buddhist communities. And we can talk about it more in the question and answer, not just today, but in future weeks. Okay. But one way of thinking about the effects of rebirth is to say that your past actions, even before you were born as a human being, impact the kind of body you have. And if you think about this, is a really big deal, right? Being born a mouse versus being born a human being is going to dictate a wide realm of possibilities for your experience versus becoming a cat or worse comes to worse, ending up in a hell realm or otherwise. So to make this a little bit more interesting, I thought we'd do a little bit more art. And I will show you a couple images representing the different places we can go, even though we're going to go relatively quickly here. And for your benefit, as somebody asked, I labeled a couple of these images. Both the video clips we saw before and these images that we're going to see in a minute, I'll make sure I link to in some way, shape, or form below the YouTube clip, so you can come back to them even though we're moving relatively quickly. All right, so we're going to share here, if I can figure out how to do so, some very, very famous images that perhaps you've seen, oops, of the possibilities of rebirth. All right. So hopefully we can see here this image called the Bhavacakra, which translates to something like the wheel of being. Sometimes it's translated as the wheel, a chakra. You see a wheel here of becoming. The idea here is this is the wheel of our path of rebirth. And this kind of nasty looking demon like God is usually associated with the God being the God of the lower realms or the hell like realms. And there are a lot of hells, hot ones and cold ones, in most Buddhist conceptions of things. Yama is not a creator God, but sometimes he has the role of judging where people end up in their next rebirth. But again, really important to distinguish Yama from either like a monotheistic deity or a devil-like figure. He is really responding to the natural consequences of our actions. All right, so we're going to look in a minute at some of these images here. The basic idea, this outer realm of the wheel has to do with a much more complicated series of cause and effect connections that lead to our suffering. We're not going to look at those today. But in here, this like not quite inner wheel before we get to the hub is split up into this case, 5, sometimes 6 different places you can be reborn. So we're going to look at some of those. All of these images are from the Huntington archive, which if you have some time on the weekend to goof around and look at Buddhist art, is a beautiful place. One of a couple of really beautiful sites we have for Buddhist art, and I will do my best to link to these for the video. All right, so in any event, a couple things to say here, and the way this is a review. At the very hub of the wheel, which if you think about it, is that which spins the wheel, is not the god Yama from before. It's actually our own activities. What are these activities? Well, the pig, I don't know if you can tell that he's a pig, this black animal here represents our ignorance of the nature of reality. We don't know that much about reality yet in this class yet, but one of the pieces is going to be karma. So our ignorance of how karma works, cause and effect. We deny that there's going to be a cause and effect relationship. Also, we deny the reality of change leading to suffering. We think, even though I know I spent 20 minutes thinking about it last week, I'm pretty suspicious about this business about change leading to suffering. I'm still going to go all in on desire and craving and attachment, right? Which is our normal instinct. This is from the Buddhist perspective. And if you're offended, that's great. This is in a way an offensive teaching, right? The idea is that no, that's just simply ignorance. The idea that you're ever going to find satisfaction through satisfying your desires, even your spiritual desires, is simply false. That's the pitch. So we have ignorance. The snake, maybe you can guess. The nastiness of the snake is an image of anger or aversion. We talked about this last time. It's not just the fact that there are unpleasant things in life or that our pleasant states change, but we respond and make them worse by pushing away the bad, right? Or even getting angry about the bad. And then this image here, sometimes you get a peacock or just a rooster of some kind, is usually associated with passion, right? So this idea here is that these 3 responses or kind of negative intentions in our actions, which start, by the way, in our minds. Their mental karma literally spin the wheel. And then these kind of lighter actions are actions motivated by some form of generosity or kindness or caring, and they help you move up to better rebirths, which we'll talk about. And then these ones over here, you can guess, are nasty ones, influenced by ignorance, craving, attachment, and especially anger, and they're going to send you in the wrong direction. So you notice the spinning wheel is driven by what? It's driven by desire, anger, passion, by our responses, by our own mental, physical, verbal actions. And where do they get you? Well, best case scenario, you're doing nice things motivated by patience in the face of anger, generosity in the face of others in need, and on, could land you in a divine realm. And so up here you have all sorts of gods. By the way, gods are not enlightened beings in this case, but they live really long, pleasant lives. Or a pretty good one is being a jealous god because you live a long time and you're powerful. But you can see here, the problem with being a jealous god is that you are fighting with the gods themselves or the devas, right? We're not going to get off track too much about jealous gods, but sometimes in New York City, because I teach in New York, I make jokes about it. This is like having a nice apartment on the Upper West Side is a jealous god. And what's your biggest problem, right? Those obnoxious people who have the apartments or the suites on Fifth Avenue, right? So you can't just enjoy your own kind of pleasant lot in life. Someone always has more money. Someone always has a better. And even though I'm trying to make this funny, I think we all know that this form of jealousy drives our world and drives our culture, right? So even the good rebirth, this is important, of becoming a jealous God or a God itself is not liberation from suffering. And in fact, the suffering of gods when they fall from grace is supposed to be one of the worst kinds of suffering. So we can talk about that in a discussion later if you like. All right, but that's the good news. The good news is still suffering, but at least it's suffering in a nice environment with a nice apartment, a nice view of the park, nice music, good food, right? All right. Over here we have human realm. Okay. Human realm is actually a really good place to live because it allows you to study Buddhism. That's the pitch, right? From the Buddhist tradition. It allows us to get smart. Okay. But plenty of the options, and here I'm going to look at some images from a different um, representation of the Bhavacakra. Okay, these are both Tibetan. This is a Tibetan image. That's a mural, I believe. And this one is a mural at a different monastery in Ladakh, which is part of cultural Tibet, but is now part of India. Okay, here you're going to see more representations of human beings and other human activities, right? But we're also going to see the animal realm. What's the problem with being an animal? The simple version of this is that in animal realms, people are too dumb to be Buddhists, right? I mean, that's a bit of a simplification, but I recognize if we watch nature films, or maybe there are biologists here, that I realize that whales have all sorts of intelligence and birds, right? That's fine. But the basic problem is that without a human mind or a godlike mind, you don't have the capacity to process the nature of reality, discipline yourself through meditation, otherwise, and do something about it. So, also, right, as you can imagine, most animals live lives of suffering where they're dealing with forces beyond their control. All right, so these are the first three: God, jealous God, and human rebirths, which are supposed to be the positive ones. And then the next ones are animal realm, but it gets a lot worse. Yikes. Here's a representation of a hell realm. There's hot ones and cold ones, torture. And then over here, you have the only slightly better rebirth of being a hungry ghost. There are all sorts of really fascinating ideas about what it means to be a ghost in Buddhist cultures throughout Asia. This is a famous representation from India with these really fat bellies and thin necks. The basic idea here is these are beings that can never satiate themselves, right? Because of their past actions, even when they're exposed to food or water, they can't even be nourished by that food. It chokes them or it burns their throat, which, without getting too heavy, is really very heartbreaking. You can think about human beings or other animals that don't have enough to survive on, right? So there's a really pretty horrifying vision of the different kinds of bodies we can take. Usually, Buddhist teachings about the six realms, right, are pedagogically driven to basically, without, it's no nice way of putting this, scare the bejesus out of you, if you excuse me for saying that, or whatever curse you'd like to use, right? The idea is to really, 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 really freak out about the possibility of being reborn in a worse realm. Meaning, since we are lucky to have human bodies and human minds, more importantly, we better take advantage. And what does that mean? It means following Buddhist teachings, at least in this context. Is that clear so far? And so these images themselves are beautiful art, but also intentionally scary. Questions so far? You can put them in the chat if you like. I know this is a lot of material. All right, but we're just getting going. This is often the part of karma that people stop at, rebirth, right? But I just want to note mentions here, and this is going to be one of the ultimate goals of this class to understand how this fits. This is the Buddha up here. The Buddha is not in any of the six realms. He's not even in the divine realm, though sometimes he shows up there to teach, as we saw earlier. The Buddha is out. Is that clear? To be awakened, to wake up from the dream of our ignorance, is to escape rebirth. So, this is our first real definition of what liberation means. Going along with escaping suffering is escaping rebirth altogether. Now, for most Buddhist traditions, and we saw this in the offering ceremonies, this is one of the reasons I want to show to you. Buddhists or Buddhas or awakened beings are available to us. Just because they're out of rebirth doesn't mean they're gone. They haven't disappeared altogether, but they're not subject to the wheel, basically because they understand things properly. So they're not generating the effects of negative actions, unlike us. So, in the spirit of getting a little bit more nervous, which I hope we will get if we're going to understand the material, let's think a little bit more about the effects. So, the first pitch is the body you have is the effect of past actions. By the way, regardless of whether you are committed to or open minded about karma and rebirth, and I know we probably all have very different ideas about this, the idea that our bodies themselves are part of an inheritance of a deep past, even if you understand that evolutionarily, which is, of course, very different from Buddhist cosmology, makes a lot of sense, right? Your human body didn't just come from nowhere, right? Rather, the concept being that to be a human being or have the possibility of a human being is itself an effect of a whole chain of relationships, right? Regardless of what we think about souls or God-given souls, the very fact of your body with its DNA, right, connected to the ancestors or past generations you had, right, connects you to a whole long process of cause and effect relationships. I think this is pretty much undeniable, right? If we just think about genetic traits and the like. So, of course, we have a very different model for thinking about this, but it is helpful to take seriously that our bodies aren't just simply, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere, right? They, in fact, are the effects of long series and chains of actions. How are we doing so far? If you'd like to add any questions to the chat, please do. All right, but we're only barely getting started here with karma. Hope that you enjoyed some images before we do a little bit more talk. All right, so rebirth is one effect. The second effect here is the second thing that people often think about when they learn about karma. And these are simply experiences. In some of the literature, especially Tibetan literature that I'm most familiar with, this is called effects that are like their causes, which is a little bit technical, but it actually makes sense. The idea here is, and I'm just going to come up with a silly example, right? You might wonder, why on earth did somebody just hit me today? Like maybe you were a kid. I hope nobody's been hurt physically, obviously. That's not a joke, right? But imagine, you were playing in the schoolyard when you were in the third grade, right? And some bully came up and hit you on the head. And you say, why me? There are all these other kids that person could have hit. Or why today, right? Why on Wednesday instead of Monday did I get hit in the head? Well, one karmic answer would be because of a past action of yours. Now, some of the past actions, let's say verbal ones, would be obvious. If you called that person a name, right? Or teased them in the first grade or the second grade, you're more likely to get hit in the head. Cause and effect, right? But it's also possible that the effect is deep in your past. So perhaps in a past life or 5 lifetimes ago, I don't know, you were a boxer for a living. You boxed, right? And maybe, I don't know, you were respectful to your opponents, but still you hit them as hard as you possibly could. And that's how you supported yourself, right? And there's going to be some kind of long-term consequence for these physical actions. Is this clear? Right? And it only pops up much later. I'll give you another example that's maybe a little bit more palatable to us of effects like their causes. So one example would be, let's say you get into an elevator. I'm thinking about this because I'm in New York City, or you all go for a walk in the park with a close friend, right? And all of a sudden, what enters into the elevator or walks in front of you in the park, but like an adorable poodle, right? Imagining that. And your friend, strange as that person is, I don't know, maybe they're like a retired Marine or something, a courageous human being, freaks out, right? He jumps out of the way, hides behind you, right? Yelps, right? And you're thinking, Jimmy, what are you so scared about this cute poodle for? Right? So why do you guys think that the person's so scared of the poodle? Probably it's a consequence of an experience or an action, right? That they experienced in childhood, let's say, right? Like maybe Jimmy or your friend got bit when they were a little kid. They may not even remember the biting, right? But the action, which is a physical action, even if it's not your fault, of being bit, right? Or freaking out after you were bit by a dog, is going to reemerge deep into your future. Is that clear? And all of a sudden it pops up only under the right conditions, right? You're not going to freak out about dogs that aren't there, but the second one shows up that looks the same way or reminds you of the dog that bit you 30 years before, all of a sudden, right, you get really fearful. Do you see how this might go? So, this idea of actions at a distance, our experiences in one moment having a deep impact on our experiences far into the future, actually makes a lot of sense. Of course, in the Buddhist context, right? The idea is that these actions can actually continue over the course of lifetimes, which again, honestly, is hard for, I think, some people to reconcile if you didn't grow up in a culture that's committed to karma, but at least asking us to take it seriously, this possibility. All right. But we already see that our actions, our physical ones, our verbal ones, and especially our intentions, our mental actions that lead to physical and verbal can have huge consequences, leading to what kind of body we get in the future, but also the experiences we have in this body. All right, next two examples, which I think are going to be a little bit more familiar to you, but I think are crucial for understanding the full extent of the karmic understanding of things. The third one has to do with habits. This is the most obvious and yet perhaps the most powerful. This is the worst news and the best news of the day, which is simply the effect of an action. If you do it once, you're more likely to do it again. If you do it twice, you're more likely to do it 4 times. You do it 10 times, you're more likely to do it 100 times. And here, again, please think of your own examples. Ones I like to talk about in class have to do with your morning breakfast routine or brushing your teeth. Think about how mindlessly we engage in our habitual activities, right? And kudos to anyone who maintains an attitude of gratefulness before they're brushing, right? Their tops and their bottoms or whatever else it might be, right? I'm sure there's some folks like that here in the audience. But for most of us, right, we are just on autopilot. Why? Because when you start doing things over and over again, you don't even notice them. And yet they have massive impacts. Now you can start thinking about the habitual nature of our speech patterns. If our speech patterns weren't so automatic and habitual, it'd be hard to communicate with each other. It's kind of miraculous. And yet, think about how quickly we are to fall into ruts. Not even just saying something mean or unsensitive, although of course I'm sure we all do this by accident, literally, right? But simply parroting ideas that we've heard without really considering them, right? Not paying attention to children or family members or friends totally when we're speaking. Why? Because of the habituation. Okay, why is this bad news? It's bad news because we habituate not only our speech and our actions, but our mind. That's the pitch, which means that if we react to positive things with desire, craving, attachment, jealousy, pride, negative things with anger or aversion, we are generating the mental habits to repeat those responses over and over and over and over again. If we use violent language or disrespectful language, or even have mental thoughts, right, of frustration. So, for example, I'm in New York City and we get frustrated with people all the time on the subway, and you just think things in your mind, right? Again, hopefully we all use respectful language when we do so, but you might think really nasty things about people, right? Even nice people think nasty things about people. What's the point? You're going to have consequences there. What are the consequences? I can't predict. I'm not an enlightened being. But the idea is there's going to be a consequence. And how many moments of mental habit do we have in a given day? How many moments are there? We're constantly developing karma. Now, what's the good news? The good news is that with attention to our mental habits, and our verbal habits and our physical habits, we can literally transform our future. And I'm going to give one more example here. Okay. We've already talked about transforming the possibility of your future body, transforming your experiences in the future, right? Whether or not you get hugged or punched. Yeah. We've talked about transforming our habits through attending to them. If you get a good habit and you do it enough times, it's a lifetime. I'm sure some of you have those habits, things you've been doing all the time that are really beneficial. You're generous, you're charitable, you pray, maybe you lead other people in prayer, right? You have a relationship with the divine or a relationship with real human beings that you talk to all the time, whatever it might be. I mean, we all have our examples, right? I mean, things I hope we could be somewhat proud of that doesn't take so much effort to do them every time, right? Maybe some people say, how on earth have you lived a life where you do this? And you say, well, I just started doing it a bunch and now I have to think twice about it, right? I mean, it happens for our beneficial activities. And it also happens in meditation, which we'll talk about later, which means that you can train your mind. Now, it takes a long time in most Buddhist traditions, but it really is possible. By habituating yourself to your own mental nature, you can slowly but surely transform it, especially by transforming your attention, right? And then all of a sudden, literally the sky's the limit. Remember where the Buddha was up in the sky? That's the limit. Because karma works. Cause and effect really, really works. So this is the bad news. What's the bad news? We're not even aware on a moment-to-moment basis of our mental, verbal, and even physical actions. And we saw from the nasty pictures of rebirth that, at least in Buddhist conception, that can land people in really bad places. And frankly, you don't need those images. You just read the newspaper, right? I mean, we know, and there's nothing funny about this. People really suffer, right? And yet the possibility is for transformation, one habit at a time. Great news. But you can't skip to the end. All right, last little bit that I think is fascinating that's going to help us next week. And this has to do with what I call in my classes, picking up on some Tibetan ideas, or at least Tibetan versions of these teachings, the effect on your environment. There's the simple version of this and the complicated version. And here you can see in parentheses, I say, the effect of your environment, what's called the environmental effect, is really the effect of how you perceive what's around you. How you perceive what's around you. Okay, how does this go? The simple version is you could do really nice things in this life, which means act patiently and be generous. And then 3 cheers, you get reborn as a human being, which is considered to be a really good rebirth, right? But you also in this lifetime or in past lifetimes were less than generous. So what environment are you born into in the next lifetime? You're born into an environment of that's impoverished, let's say, where no one around you has sufficient means. See how this goes? It's not simply the body that you get, but also the environment around it. That would be the most literal rendition. Is that clear? Now, in a human birth, where you are reborn into an environment that's impoverished, you also could have a loving, supportive family because of other past actions. So it's not as if there's a calculation. It's not like you have a bank account. This is a common misunderstanding, like a sin and virtue bank account, plus minus, and then you calculate. That's not how it works. All actions have effects, and you never know when they're going to arise. By the way, this is what human life is like. Are things always going swimmingly for you or terribly? No, at any given day, 12 things happen, 50 things happen, right? And you never have any idea what caused them. At least that's what my life is like. Maybe you guys have figured it out, right? There are all these different, what I sometimes call vectors of cause and effect relationships at play, whether they're economic or political or interpersonal or familial or whatever it is, medical or whatever it might be, right? I mean, there's so many different pieces. Even you just think about your medical health, how many different pieces are moving at a time, right? Hope that people are more or less healthy here, but if you have any ailments, but then your diet, what did you eat? What's the weather like? It's so gross and muggy here in New York City, but that sets off all sorts of responses in our bodies, right? There are all these different vectors. And here I'm just talking about our physical reactions in one day, let alone in a lifetime. So what's the point? You can have karma that's going to dictate your current body. You're going to have karma that's going to dictate different experiences you have at any given time. You get hugged or you get punched. Remember that? And then causes that are going to be dictating your environment. How is this sounding so far? All right. But this perception piece is a really big deal, especially for next week, especially in the Tibetan tradition, although all traditions conceive of this, because we actually have a lot of experience with the way that our mental actions, our physical actions, and our verbal actions, and sometimes the metaphor they use is perfume our perception of our experiences, right? Like perfume. They change the smell. What does that mean? Have you ever had an experience like you can think about in rom-coms or something where you fall in love and then it seems like the birds are chirping for you, right? And even if it's a rainy day, you're thrilled by the miracle of, I don't know, the rain, right? Dropping on your head, right? And then the sound of people all around you talking, and you can't help but smile at the miracle of humanity and human being, right? But then you break up with somebody or you get into a fight with a friend, and then everyone around you's acting kind of nasty. You ever notice that? Like at the supermarket or something, someone cuts you off. It just happens to be that you had got in an argument with your significant other or a family member or a sibling or something like that earlier the day. You ever notice that? I notice this all the time in New York because the weather totally dictates what New Yorkers are like. Like on rainy days, it's a nightmare to commute. Everyone is just in a grumpy mood, which means the train is late, people push and shove, no one makes enough space for each other, they get each other wet, no one takes their backpack off on a crowded subway. The list goes on. Someone cuts you off. It always happens, right? But then on a nice sunny day, it's incredible. People are actually kind. They let each other pass in front of you. Someone gets up for you or you offer a seat in the subway. It really does feel this way. Yeah. I say sometimes in class, it's like if you're the kind of person who always cheats on tests, then what do you think everyone else is doing? Cheating on tests. That's why you have to cheat. This is a big deal nowadays with AI, which isn't exactly cheating. We could talk about it. But in any event, if you perceive that everyone else is taking shortcuts, like on their taxes or otherwise, of course you're going to do it. You don't want to be the sucker, right? But if you're innocent in that you're honest about following rules or whatever it might be, right? Then you assume that everyone else is honest. And then you're horrified or shocked when somebody breaks a rule. Now, look, this is a bit of a simplification. So you have to go along with me. This is why I'm asking you to generate real examples. But we do have plenty of experiences of the ways in which our settled mental attitudes, habitual ways of speaking to people. If you're polite, all of a sudden everyone's like behaves as if they're from the Midwest, right? If you're obnoxious to people, everyone's like they're from, I don't know, I don't want to pick on anyone, but imagine your own stereotype, right? I grew up in the Boston area. So you can say, look, if everyone, right, if you're mean to people, then everyone is obnoxious like they are in Boston or something, right? Come up with your own example, right? Why? Because we really do attend to, we notice that which we are creating through our own mental habits. It really is powerful. This is an example of how, even in this life, our actions are perfuming our experience. Now, look, there are limits. There's no way that your mental actions in this life, if you habituate yourself to watching the Nature Channel, suddenly tomorrow morning you're going to wake up as a turtle. Is that clear? And this does not mean that if you habituate yourself to thinking about your stocks and bonds or whatever, you're going to wake up tomorrow and be a billionaire. It doesn't work that way. It's not magic. You cannot control these effects, but it's undoubtedly the case that our mental experiences impact our very perception of our environment around us. This is bad news. Why? Because no one gets off scot free. This is not about reward and punishment. There's no singular monotheistic God that's rewarding you or punishing you in this Buddhist system. That's so important to understand the logic. It's just cause and effect, which is scary. Also, because you don't even know what you did this morning. At least I don't, let alone what you've been doing for your whole life or past lives if you're committed to that possibility. So, how do you know what's coming for you? We think about how scary that is. If you don't even know the actions, especially all the mental actions, you remember what you're thinking about at 3 o'clock last Thursday? Then we have no idea what's coming for us. This is part of the instability of being a human being. So, to return to some of the material from last week, remember we were talking about the problem of suffering? And I said it's so much worse than you thought. This is the suffering of conditions. Can you see this down here? We said we judge bad things as negative and then we push them away and we're attached to comfort. We respond negatively to the change when we lose the things that we like, or at the very least, right? We prepare our future suffering when we enjoy ice cream, but tomorrow it has to be broccoli. But then we talked about this broader instability of being a human being with a body that's always changing, that's depending on food, shelter, other human beings, and those conditions are all changing. Remember this? And we have a mind that's subject to all of the experiences we have. But also, the suffering of conditions is about our activities. This is shorthand for karma. So often, the suffering of conditions is a description of living in a world of karma. Why is this a world of instability? Because past actions are constantly coming to fruition and you never know. And I don't mean to be preaching here. This is by no means a sermon. I'm just trying to explain the ideas, right? But think about that. Please, if we're taking this seriously, we all know how unstable life is. And this is why we do not have any control of when things come to fruition. It's obvious if we're honest about it, which should scare us, as I mentioned. It's not just being scared because we might get reborn here. Right? I mean, that's scary if you're committed to rebirth and the possibility of hell, which I don't know, some people might believe in hell of some sort, and some people might not, right? But if you are like a scientific materialist, as we sometimes talk about in the United States, and you're committed to this one life and only, right? No rebirth, right? Which we'll talk about how that fits in or doesn't fit into Buddhist practice later, right? Even if that's your idea, right? We still have plenty to be scared about, right? Because we can't control even in this lifetime, right? I hate to say this, but this is a classic Tibetan meditation. And this is easily the meanest thing I'm going to say all semester. I promise this is not my idea, but it's true. It's a very common Tibetan meditation. Spend 30 seconds asking yourself if you're sure you're even going to wake up tomorrow morning. Are you sure? Are you sure everyone who's on the Zoom is going to be here next Thursday? I don't say that to be mean. This is a classic meditation, but it really is true. We do not know when actions are going to come to fruition. Karma. So, without the motivation of taking seriously cause and effect, many Buddhist teachers, I can't speak for everybody, but many Buddhist teachers say you will never, ever be motivated to take seriously the path to liberation, right? It comes from this fear of the consequences of our experiences to motivate ourselves to do the, I think, exciting but potentially unpleasant work at looking at our own ignorance and mistakes. Is that piece clear? All right. Now, there are some lighter parts of the story I want to close with, and then we'll do some conversation, which is to say, not everyone can become a monk and nun and do the 3 hours of meditating before breakfast. Is that clear? Because we're all human beings and we have obligations. No problem. Karma is a gift for all the people who are too busy to become monks and nuns. Why? Because it allows for or gives a path, let's say, it gives a structure for other human beings, right? What we call lay people, non-Buddhist professionals, to improve their karma. So the fancy way of improving your karma through disciplined study, especially if you're lucky enough to be able to dedicate yourself to the path of liberation, is meditation, where you bring awareness to your experiences and you start noticing your mental habits that really do allow you to reprogram your experience of the world. That's the ambitious project we're going to continue with in the next 3 weeks, and then hopefully into the spring if you'd like to be along for that ride. But also, right, just everyday folks can generate positive actions, positive verbal actions, positive intentions by doing things like what we saw in the videos, making offerings to monks and nuns. Because if the monks and nuns are doing good religious work, how much the better? That support them by generously, with a positive intention, offering them food or caring for them, right? Or going to images of enlightenment, of statues of Buddha, and generating positive karma by prostrating, by bowing, making prayers and the like. These are what are called good karma. right? And it also allows us to celebrate the professionals themselves who might do this work for us. By supporting the Buddhist professionals, they can offer prayers, engage in their own meditative practices, and help us. You see how this goes? So, karma literally is the explanation of 90% of Buddha's activity, both the ambitious project of reprogramming our experiences and the mundane everyday practices of going to a temple, which really can help you both in this lifetime and if you're committed to this idea, future lifetimes. All right, so thank you for your patience with 1 hour on karma. I know there's a lot of material here. We'll do our best to integrate comments about karma throughout our future weeks because, in a way, we're never done with karma. That's what it means, right? But also, in a more mundane way, we'll try to talk about it a little bit more. But let's at least break for now. I think that that's plenty. And I would love to hear any questions or comments if you have them. Thank you again for your patience.
If you have a question or a comment, you want to just unmute yourself or raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
I do think as people are kind of either building up the courage or considering some of the material for questions, the real challenge is to start with the habit instructions. Again, the point of this class is not to make anyone Buddhist, obviously. It's just to think and take seriously Buddhist ideas. But I think that a really productive way for taking the ideas seriously is to just notice how sticky our habitual actions are. And then the second step might be to be how sticky our habitual attitudes are in dictating how we perceive our environment. And once you start to notice these connections, which I'm sure people on this Zoom have thought about before, but once you make a habit of noticing them, I think you start to recognize that actually these cause and effect relationships are really, 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 really pervasive, even in the examples where we pretend like they're not operating. So again, I'm not here to give anyone life advice by any means. We'd all be in trouble if that was my job. But I would really recommend, if you're willing to take this seriously over the next week, start to notice these examples of habits and the impact of our mental attitudes on our perception of our environment. I have to say, from personal experience, it really can be almost shockingly transformative. I don't know for the better or for worse, but really does change our perception of what's happening. Any questions while we're here, examples you were thinking about during this long talk? So one more thing I'll say while people are considering here, since we do have another couple of minutes, and we've talked about the realms of existence. That's tricky. Is Buddhist conceptions of what it means to be a god or the divine. This is, of course, a huge topic, but I should say it's a really common misunderstanding that Buddhist cultures don't believe in gods. Now, there are all sorts of interesting arguments from India against the possibility of an omniscient, omnipotent, personal creator God or any combination of these ideas. So it's very clear in the Buddhist system there is no monotheistic God. And most Buddhist cultures are really committed to the possibility of there being powerful beings, some of them who are on our side that help compassionately, some of whom are a little bit more selfish, some of whom are almost demonic, simply as an outcome of karma. There are all sorts of powerful beings, which is why, actually, in most Buddhist communities, managing and praying and making offerings to gods, just divine, powerful forms, is everyday practice. And we saw some of that video. So please don't think that just because Buddha is not a god, that means that everyday Buddhists aren't worried about divine realities. In fact, it's almost always the opposite. There are some exceptions, especially in the last 2 centuries, but generally speaking, gods are actually a really, really, really big deal in Buddhist communities. And maybe I'll stop there. So there's a really nice question about the offerings.
Yep.
It really.
I think Jenny has a question.
Oh, great. So let me just quickly respond to one in the chat. Apologies, Kim. Thank you so much. And then maybe we can hear
I don't
Jenny's.
see the chat. Okay.
I think there's multiple chats. But in any event, Patricia, thank you for the question. The question has to do with what is the intent of making offerings and what response is hoped for. So there's different levels to it. Sometimes in some traditions, you are going to a representation of Buddha or other kind of helper beings and just asking for things. You're saying, I'm making an offering to you. Will you please help me get married, have a child, help my uncle or an aunt recover from an illness, help us with the crop, give us some more rain, help me do well on this exam, right? So it could be quite practical. But more broadly, it's pretty common to understand the offerings if they are delivered with a mental intention, a positive mental intention of generosity, right? Being a way of generating positive karma, right? So if already you are making an offering to a person in need, that's a way of generating the habit of generosity. But even better from the perspective of most Buddhist traditions, if you're making that offering to a representation of the Buddha himself and the community, because who do the offerings really go to? They go to the monks and the nuns supporting the temple. Is that clear? And we know, at least in theory, that those folks are doing the right thing because they're helping others by teaching other people about Buddhism. Is that clear? And so the idea is like a guaranteed uh, good recipient for your actions. Is literally, there's a term for this. It's called being a field of merit. It's like, if you make end of the year donations, you can go online and there are ratings about the different charities. Like these folks are totally corrupt. These folks put all of their money to feeding the hungry. You know what I'm talking about? So literally the idea in many Buddhist communities is that the monks and nuns are themselves the best recipients of the offerings because if you're feeding monks and nuns, they're doing the right thing. Do you see how this goes? So that's, again, a way in which offerings are part of the karmic system. So apologies to cut off whoever was going to ask a question now, please.
Ginny, you had a question?
Well, it was more of a comment, and it seems that to me, it would be in my own self-interest to be kind, generous, and respectful if I understand karma. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely right. So part of the karmic teachings are going to be one, scaring us all so that we selfishly cease our negative habits and rewarding us in the future for positive habits. Absolutely right, Ginny. Now, next week, it'll get more complicated because we're going to ask the impossible question, which is who is the person who benefits? So, for example, if you guys are reborn as another human being, or your instructor here is reborn as a turtle next lifetime, or a mosquito, or worse, if I'm in hell realm or something, right? Who is really benefiting? Is it still me? Is it still Josh Shapiro, the turtle? It's a little more complicated than we might think. So we'll get back to that. But Ginny, yeah, absolutely, you're right. That's generally how these teachings are delivered. So this would be a skillful appeal to our desire. No problem. It's a good start. Does that answer your question or your comment?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for jumping in.
Anybody have anything else?
All right. Well, thank you so much for being patient with me today. I know it's a lot of material. If you want to consider some questions too, and you can even just throw them right into the chat at the beginning of our next session, I'm happy to consider them, right? And as we get closer to the end, we still have a few more weeks of this, of course. I'm happy to try to focus more time on question and answers if you have them. By the way, maybe Kim will mention this, we're not going to have a session next week because of a religious conflict, but then we'll pick up in 2 weeks and we'll have, I think, 3 more sessions then.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I was going to mention that. Yep. So next week you're off, but you have time to watch the recordings if you'd like to watch the recordings. And again, if you have any questions, you want to send them along to us, we can make sure that Dr. Shapiro gets them, or we can, like you said, put them in the chat ahead of time, and then you can get some answers during the session. So the next session then is on the 9th. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and, find peace in everything you do. And we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
everyone.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Joshua.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.